Michael Clauer didn't lose his house in a card game, and he didn't lose it playing dice. He didn't default on a loan, didn't miss a mortgage payment for 6 months and get a warning letter he ignored. He owned his house outright, free and clear, worth north of $300,000. No bank holding a lien on a single brick of it. No monthly note hanging over the family's head. And while he was 8,000 miles away, in Iraq, risking his life for his country every single day, his own neighbors sold that house out from under him for less than the price of a used pickup truck. Here is the number that should stop you cold. $3,201. Say it slowly and it still doesn't sound real. That is what a $300,000 home sold for at a public auction in Texas, over an unpaid debt of less than $800. Not stolen in the night, not hacked, not seized by some faceless Wall Street bank. Sold legally on paper with a rubber stamp of due process, while a United States Army captain was running convoy security through some of the deadliest stretches of highway in that entire war. He had no idea any of it was happening at all. By the time anyone told him, the deed had already changed hands, been resold, and a stranger was living in his family's house, asking his wife and daughters about rent. This is the story of how a debt smaller than a car payment nearly cost a soldier's family everything they owned, and of a countdown nobody warned him he was running until it had already hit zero. It is also the story of what happens when that same soldier comes home and decides to fight the system with everything the law will give him, and of just how much it costs in years and in nerve to make an old law actually protect the people it was written for. Michael Clauer was a captain in the United States Army Reserve, later the Army National Guard. He and his wife May had 2 young daughters and a home in Frisco, Texas they owned free and clear. No mortgage, no monthly note, just a family in a paid-off house in a quiet subdivision called Heritage Lakes. It was, by every outward measure, the finish line of the American dream, the version of it people spend 20 years climbing toward, and they'd already crossed it. Then in February of 2008, Michael's country called, and he answered the way he always had. He shipped out to Iraq to take command of a support company, more than 100 soldiers under him, tasked with one of the most dangerous assignments in the entire theater. Convoy security. Every mile of Iraqi highway was a roll of the dice. IEDs buried in the sand, ambushes in the shimmering heat, the low hum of adrenaline that never fully switches off. Men who do this job learn to live in a kind of suspended present tense, because thinking too far ahead, to tomorrow, to next month, to home, can get you killed today. Before he left, Michael did what soldiers are trained to do. He put his affairs in order, checked every box a checklist could think to include. He trusted that the machinery of home would hold steady while he was gone. He trusted the system. What he could not have known was that back in Texas, a different kind of danger was already circling his family. And this one didn't wear a uniform, didn't carry a weapon, and would never once raise its voice. It filed paperwork. Somewhere on a calendar nobody was watching, a clock had already started running, and neither Michael nor May would learn how far it had already run until more than a year after it hit zero. Convoy duty in that war meant long stretches of highway where the ground itself could kill you. A pothole might be a pothole. It might also be freshly disturbed earth packed around an artillery shell wired to a cell phone. Soldiers under Michael's command learned to read the road the way sailors read weather, scanning for anything out of place, any car parked at an odd angle, any pile of trash that hadn't been there the week before. Michael's job was to get more than 100 of those soldiers through that gauntlet again and again and bring them home. It is the kind of responsibility that rewires how a person thinks about risk, danger, and control. You learn fast to manage the things you can control and to make peace with the ones you can't, trusting that the parts of your life you left behind will simply hold their shape until you get back to them. But while Michael was scanning the roads of Baghdad for buried bombs, he had no idea that the real mine had already been laid, back home under his own front step in Texas. Because while Michael learned to survive one kind of danger overseas, another kind of danger, quieter, slower, entirely domestic, had already begun closing in back home. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being a military spouse during a deployment, almost impossible to describe to someone who hasn't lived it. It isn't just missing a person, it is living inside a permanent, low-grade siren, a fear that never fully turns off, because any car that slows down outside your house, any unfamiliar knock at the door, might be the moment two soldiers in dress uniforms step out to deliver the worst news of your life. Clauer lived inside that siren for months, holding a household together with two little girls who kept asking when Daddy was coming home, a question she couldn't answer with certainty, because in a war zone, certainty is the first casualty. The nights were often the hardest part, when the house went quiet and there was nothing left to distract from the waiting. That siren didn't stay abstract. It became a very specific, very ordinary act of self-protection. May stopped opening her mail. Court documents would later describe exactly this. A woman so afraid of what news might arrive in an envelope that she simply let the stack grow on the counter. Try for a moment to sit inside that fear. Every white envelope becomes a potential landmine. Is this a bill, junk, or the letter that changes everything? When you don't know and you're already running on fumes, the easiest thing in the world is to tell yourself you'll deal with it tomorrow. And then tomorrow becomes next week, and next week becomes a drawer you don't open. Grief and fear, when they go untreated, don't stay contained. They spread quietly into every corner of a routine until even the smallest tasks start to feel unmanageable. This wasn't irresponsibility. It was self-preservation, plain and simple. And the one piece of mail that mattered most looked exactly like all the others. Somewhere inside that ordinary human, entirely understandable pile of unopened mail were notices from the Heritage Lakes Homeowners Association. The Clauers owed roughly $800 in dues, the kind of routine neighborhood fee that pays for landscaping, pool maintenance, and clubhouse upkeep. It was a rounding error against a $300,000 asset, the kind of bill most families would pay off with whatever cash happened to be sitting in a kitchen drawer. It should have been the easiest problem in the world to fix. It would instead become the fault line that nearly swallowed the family whole. And every single day that stack of mail sat untouched, the clock the Clauers didn't know existed ticked one day closer to zero. The Heritage Lakes Homeowners Association's attorneys didn't just make a paperwork mistake. They found a loophole, and they used it. Texas HOA law, at the time, gave associations something close to a legal superpower: the power to sell a family's home without ever setting foot in front of a judge. No hearing, no courtroom, no moment where a family gets to stand up and explain themselves. All it took was the right paperwork, filed correctly. There was one thing standing in their way: a law called the Service Members Civil Relief Act. A piece of armor, decades old, built for exactly this moment. A soldier deployed, unreachable, unable to answer a summons from a foxhole. It existed to make families like the Clauers untouchable while a husband or wife was at war. To get around it, the HOA's attorneys swore, under oath, that neither Michael nor May Clauer was on active military service. Not an oversight, not a clerical slip. A sworn legal statement filed to clear the one obstacle between the HOA and an empty house, and it was false. So the machinery moved forward. In May of 2008, while Captain Michael Clauer was somewhere in Iraq, briefing convoy routes, checking equipment, doing the unglamorous, high-stakes work of keeping over 100 young soldiers alive, the clock that had been running since the first unopened envelope hit the counter finally struck zero. His family's home was sold out from under them at a foreclosure auction in Denton County, Texas. Picture the scene, because it is so mundane it becomes almost grotesque. Courthouse steps, a weekday morning, a handful of men in polo shirts and sunglasses, clipboards in hand. The way it always looks in the small, specialized world of foreclosure investors. People who show up to these auctions the way others show up to estate sales, scanning listings for distressed properties nobody is defending. Some of them do this every week, cycling through a dozen counties, treating other people's crises as a spreadsheet of opportunities. No family present, no lawyer standing up to object, no judge behind a bench weighing the circumstances, just a number called out, a gavel, and a transaction that takes less time than buying a used car. The number on the auction slip is almost impossible to say out loud without a pause. $3,201. For a two-story brick home worth more than $300,000 with a clear view of the HOA's own clubhouse, sitting across the street from the golf course the family's own dues had helped maintain. To put that number in perspective, it was less than the cost of the kitchen appliances inside the house, less than a single semester of community college tuition, less than most Americans spend on their car in a given year. For that price, an investor who had never met the Clauers, never seen their daughter's bedrooms, never once set foot inside that house, became the legal owner of a family's entire life. Somewhere on the other side of the planet, radios crackled, engines idled, and Michael Clauer briefed his soldiers on the day's convoy route, utterly unaware that at that exact moment, on a courthouse lawn 8,000 miles away, the deed to his family's home was changing hands for less than the price of a decent used pickup. There is no villain twirling a mustache in this scene. That's what makes it so unsettling. The buyer wasn't a family looking for a home to live in. He was an investor who watches foreclosure listings the way others watch stock tickers, looking for exactly this: a distressed property nobody was defending, sold for pennies on the dollar. Within about a year, he would flip the house for $135,000, still a fraction of its true value, but 40 times what he'd paid for it. Someone made a very tidy profit off a soldier's silence. That is the real horror of this story. Not that someone cheated the system, but that the system itself was built in a way that allowed this outcome to happen cleanly, quietly, and with a rubber stamp of legality. The most unsettling detail about that morning has nothing to do with paperwork. It's the ordinariness of the people standing on those courthouse steps. They weren't monsters. They were almost certainly decent people by every measure that matters in daily life. People who paid their own bills on time, waved at their own neighbors, coached their own kids' baseball teams. They joked with each other while they waited for the auctioneer. They checked their phones. Somewhere in that crowd, a soldier's entire life was purchased for less than the price of a used truck, in between routine errands. And nobody there felt like they were doing anything wrong, because on paper, they weren't. Nobody at that auction asked where the family was. Nobody wondered aloud whether the silence from inside that house meant something other than abandonment. In the world of distressed property auctions, silence isn't a red flag. It's the entire business model. An occupied house that nobody defends is, from an investor's perspective, simply an opportunity that hasn't been claimed yet. The people bidding that morning had no way of knowing a soldier was standing convoy watch on the other side of the planet, and in a narrow legal sense, it didn't matter to the transaction whether they knew or not. The paperwork had already done the knowing for them, and the paperwork said the coast was clear, and May Clauer didn't know any of it had happened. She was still living in the house, still tucking her daughters in at night under a roof she believed, correctly under any reasonable understanding of ownership, was hers. The letters kept arriving, and she kept not opening them, trapped in the same fog of dread that had gripped her for months. The clock kept running, 1 month since the sale, then 6, then 10. For more than a year, a family lived inside a house that, on paper, no longer belonged to them, walking past bedrooms and a kitchen table that had already quietly been sold to a stranger, and nobody told them. Then in June of 2009, roughly 13 months after the gavel had come down in that courthouse parking lot, the silence broke. Michael Clauer had made it through the worst of his deployment by then. Convoy runs completed, soldiers under his command still alive. The kind of quiet, hard-won relief that combat veterans describe as almost disorienting. The strange guilt of surviving something that kills other people. And then the phone rang. It was May, her voice barely holding together, telling him what she had just learned. Their Homeowners Association had foreclosed on the house. It had already been sold. And now the new owner was asking about rent, treating the family that still lived inside the home as unwelcome tenants in a house they had built their entire life around. Put yourself, for one moment, in Michael Clauer's boots at that instant. He is a man who has spent the better part of a year staring down roadside bombs and ambush points, who has learned to compartmentalize fear because fear that isn't compartmentalized gets people killed. He commanded more than 100 soldiers through hostile territory and brought them home. He had spent 12 months proving, day after day, that he could keep people safe under conditions designed to kill them. And in that single phone call, he learned that none of it, the training, the command, the discipline, could stop a piece of paper filed in a county office. A captain who could get a convoy through an ambush zone could not stop a homeowners association from taking his own front door. There's a particular cruelty in that mismatch. In Iraq, the danger was enormous, but at least it was legible. Michael could study it, plan for it, brief his soldiers on it, and act. Back home, the danger had already come and gone before he even knew it existed. Dressed in language so mundane he wouldn't have recognized it as a threat if he'd been standing right in front of it. Dues notice, non-judicial foreclosure, auction. People who knew him at the time said the call left him so shaken that a colleague suggested he seek help processing it. A man trained to hold steady under mortar fire was rattled to his core by a letter-writing campaign from a subdivisions board. "I couldn't believe it," he would later tell a reporter. "I didn't understand how anybody could do that." Not rage, not a threat, just disbelief that something like this was even legally possible in the country he'd volunteered to defend. 3 months later, in September of 2009, Michael Clauer came home from Iraq. There is a very particular image that soldiers' families cherish. The driveway reunion, the running hug, the daughters who've grown inches since he last saw them sprinting across the lawn. Somewhere that reunion happened for the Clauers too, and for a few minutes it must have felt like everything he had been fighting to get back to. But it happened under the shadow of something almost unbearable. The home behind that reunion technically belonged to someone else now, and the new owner wanted the family out. He hadn't defrauded anyone. He'd purchased it through an entirely legal auction, and in his mind, he owned a house that a family happened to still be occupying. So a man who had spent a year keeping convoys of young soldiers alive through hostile territory came home to a fight he had no training for. The potential eviction of his own wife and daughters from the only home his family had ever owned outright. This is, in many ways, the emotional center of the entire story. The collision of two Americas. One where a man is asked to put his life on the line, no questions asked, in service of his country. And another running quietly in parallel, where a homeowners association's dues collection process doesn't pause for anything. Not deployment, not depression, not a family with 2 small children, not even the law specifically written to prevent exactly this outcome. Think about what it means to sit down for dinner in a house you no longer legally own, with 2 daughters across the table who have no idea any of this is happening. Think about tucking those daughters in at night, in bedrooms a stranger technically has the right to walk into. Michael and May made a decision in those first weeks home. The girls wouldn't be told how close they'd come to losing everything. Childhood, they decided, should stay childhood a little longer, even while the adults in the house were quietly fighting for the roof over all of their heads. But the Clawers did not walk away. They hired an attorney, Barbara Hale, and filed suit against the Heritage Lakes Homeowners Association, against the investors who'd bought the home at auction, and against the man who now occupied it, seeking either the return of their house or fair compensation for what had been taken from them. It was not a small decision. Lawsuits like this one can take years, cost more than most families have to spend, and offer no guarantee of victory at the end of it. Michael had just come home from a war zone, expecting to rebuild something quiet and ordinary. Instead, he found himself gearing up for another fight, this one with lawyers instead of soldiers, in a courtroom instead of a convoy. At the center of their case sat the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Hale argued that the foreclosure should never have happened while Michael was on active duty, and that the association's own sworn paperwork was simply false. The Homeowners Association pushed back hard. Their attorneys argued that the house wasn't technically in Michael's name. It had originally been purchased with help from May's parents, with only a portion later transferred into May's name, and therefore that he had no legal standing to invoke federal protections at all. It was a technical argument built to feel airtight in a courtroom and feel monstrous everywhere else. A soldier's own house somehow wasn't legally his enough to save. They also disputed the exact dates of his service, trying to create enough uncertainty to escape liability altogether. A spokesman for the association, who asked reporters not to use his name, because by then the backlash had grown personal and threatening, insisted the HOA hadn't known about the deployment, and that a letter from the military itself had indicated Clauer wasn't on active service when the process began. Strip away the legal language, and their defense amounted to this: we just didn't check the right folder. A soldier's family lost their home over a filing error the HOA now wanted credit for making honestly. One question hung over the whole case, and it's the one that still matters. Did they know, or should they have known, that they were about to bulldoze a family the law was built to protect and looked away anyway? As the lawsuit ground forward, the story stopped being a private legal dispute and became something much bigger. What turned it into a national flashpoint was the almost unbearable irony sitting at its center. A man in a war zone, defending the country, coming home to find his own neighbors' association had taken his house while he was gone. The story broke fast once it started, and it hit hard. Independent journalists and national outlets laid out, in plain language, how a $300,000 home could legally vanish over an $800 debt. And once it went wide, the nation didn't just read the story, it exploded with fury. Here's how you measure the temperature of that fury. Members of the Heritage Lakes Board began receiving actual death threats. Threats serious enough that the association's own spokesperson refused to let reporters print his name for his own safety. A volunteer board that existed to schedule pool hours and mow the common areas found itself the target of national rage. Because people across the political spectrum, who agreed on almost nothing else that year, agreed on this one thing. Nobody believed a soldier's family should lose their house over a landscaping fee while he was in a combat zone. Camera crews showed up outside the cul-de-sac. The clubhouse pool, the golf course, the tidy landscaping the family's own dues had helped pay for, all of it now backdrop footage for a national scandal nobody in Heritage Lakes had wanted. For nearly a year, the case ground through the courts, depositions, motions, the kind of grinding, expensive litigation that quietly bankrupts far more families than it ever vindicates. But the real story of that year wasn't in the filing cabinets. It was in the house itself. The Clauers reached an uneasy truce to keep living there, while the lawsuit played out, which meant every single morning they woke up in a home that still, on paper, belonged to a stranger. Walking past their own daughter's bedrooms, never certain a signature somewhere wouldn't end the arrangement overnight. Mowing a lawn they weren't legally certain they owned, sitting at a dinner table held together, for the time being, by nothing more than an informal handshake and the threat of bad publicity. 14 months, then 16, then 20. The clock that had started the day the mail went unopened was still running, and this time the family could feel every second of it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a battle you've technically already survived. Michael had come home from a war zone. By every measure, that should have been the hard part, the part where the danger ended and normal life resumed. Instead, he spent his first year back on American soil in a different kind of combat. One fought with depositions instead of convoys, where the enemy wore a suit instead of a uniform, and where victory, when it finally came, would arrive not as a battlefield surrender, but as a single line updated in a county property record. May, for her part, was living through a strange inversion of the fear that had gripped her during the deployment. Before, the fear had been that a knock at the door might bring the worst possible news about Michael. Now the fear was different but oddly familiar in shape. That a knock at the door, a certified letter, a process server on the porch, might mean the family had to pack up and leave the only home her daughters had ever known. Two different fears, 2 different years, but the same physical sensation every time. The sound of a car slowing down outside, the held breath before the doorbell rang. The house had become, in a strange way, the very thing she'd been most afraid of losing, and she was living inside a version of it that no longer legally belonged to her. Then in the summer of 2010, more than 2 years after Michael first shipped out, a settlement conference finally produced an agreement. A federal judge sealed the terms under a gag order, so no one has ever said publicly what it cost to make this go away. That silence itself says something. Whatever changed hands to end this case, it wasn't cheap, and it wasn't something either side wanted the public dissecting for years to come. But the outcome itself was never in doubt. In August of 2010, the deed was transferred back into the Clauer's name. After more than 2 years, a war zone, a depression, a $3,000 auction, a threatened eviction, national headlines, and death threats against strangers who'd never met them, Michael and May Clauer owned their home again. It didn't feel like a clean win, though. Michael, by his own account, stayed rattled by what the whole ordeal had shown him, how little protection an ordinary family actually has against a bureaucracy, even one that only governs a subdivision's pool schedule. May put it simply, months later, it never felt the same again. You don't relax in a place once you've learned it can be taken from you by mail you never opened, over money you didn't even know you owed. That feeling outweighed the victory. Rather than stay in the neighborhood they'd fought to reclaim, the Clauers left Texas altogether. Michael went back to active duty at Fort Lee, Virginia, and the family went with him, in part because May would finally have what Frisco never gave her the first time, a built-in community of other military spouses and direct access to support through the base itself. On a military installation, another spouse living through a deployment isn't a stranger 2 doors down who might or might not notice you've stopped answering the phone. It's someone who already knows exactly what that silence feels like, because she's lived inside the same siren herself. Support groups, family readiness programs, neighbors who check in without being asked. None of it had existed for May in Frisco, where the isolation had been allowed to fester for months before anyone noticed. The isolation that swallowed her once would not be allowed to happen again. So they sold the house. The 2-story brick home with a golf course view, the one with a clear line of sight to the very clubhouse whose dues had nearly cost them everything, became someone else's dream instead. Nobody in Heritage Lakes ever saw the Clawers move the last box out. By then, they had already learned the hardest lesson a family can learn about a house. That ownership, on paper, means almost nothing if nobody is paying attention when it's taken from you, and that a home is never really safe just because the mortgage is paid off. It's only as safe as the systems built to protect it, and the people willing to notice when those systems fail. Michael got his house back, but he couldn't sleep easy knowing the same loophole that had almost cost him everything was still sitting there, open for the next family who wouldn't have a lawyer, a journalist, or a national audience on their side. So the Clawers case became the argument lawmakers pointed to when they pushed to close it. Bills requiring court approval before any HOA foreclosure. Other proposals to strip that power away entirely. Industry lobbyists pushed back with a line that will sound familiar to anyone who's ever dealt with a homeowners association. After everything that had happened to this family, their position was still, in effect, we need the power to do this, so the grass gets cut on time. Reform won ground anyway. Notice periods got longer. Protections for service members got sharper. None of it undid what the Clauer family went through. Laws rarely repair damage already done. They only try to keep the next family out of the same hole. But somewhere in Texas right now, there is very likely a military family who will never know how close they came to losing everything, because of what happened to the Clawers. There's a certain kind of American story told every 4th of July. Flags, parades, a soldier stepping off a plane into his family's arms. Michael Clauer's story is the uncomfortable footnote that never makes the parade. Here's what's worth sitting with on the way out. Getting that house back required 4 things to line up that almost never line up together. A lawyer willing to fight a case most firms wouldn't touch. A 50-year-old federal law that nobody had thought to test in a fight like this one. A journalist who noticed a paperwork trail everyone else would have scrolled past. And a public angry enough to turn a subdivision's volunteer board into a national target overnight. Pull out any single one of those 4 locks, and this story ends the ordinary way. A moving truck and silence. The same ending waiting for the mother in Austin who never found a lawyer, or the old man in Dallas who never understood what the letter meant. They don't get a settlement. They get exactly what the paperwork says they get. None of the people who did this to the Clawers were monsters. They were people checking boxes, following a process that had already been decided for them, going home for dinner afterward without a second thought. Because the system didn't break that day. It worked exactly the way it was built to work. Michael and May got all 4 locks to open at once. Most families get 0. Go check your mailbox tonight.
This video is an original production based on research into the 10 Texas legislative archives and official court records. My goal was to provide an analytical perspective on the intersection of military law and property rights while exploring the practical application of the Service Members' Civil Relief Act. The story also serves as a psychological study of the ostrich effect and avoidant coping mechanisms. By analyzing these experiences, we provide educational value on mental health awareness and how high-stress environments can lead to an executive shutdown regarding daily administrative tasks. Every word of this script was written to offer original commentary on how bureaucratic systems can fail individual citizens. This research was produced to help others understand their rights and why legal protections require public awareness to remain effective in a modern society.